If I gotta remove and install this engine one more damn time, I swear I'm gonna freak out. Oh, didn't see you guys there. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode here at the stable, where we're gonna continue the work on the Scrappy Boy. For those of you that have been following this build for a while now, you'll know we've had more than a couple issues with header fitment. So that's where these guys come in. And I know what you're thinking, because it's probably the same thing my wife said to me.
Another set of headers?
Yes, but look how pretty they look. We just got these, and on top of that, a company reached out to us and said they wanted to send us a set of their headers. So we're gonna have a couple options to see what fits best. But that's not what this video is about. Today we're gonna continue the progress on the Scrappy Boy so we can get it started soon, guys, come on. Sorry about that, I just get worked up, especially if Ryan Macy keeps us caffeinated. Today we're working on the fuel system. Once again, this is a 16-gallon fuel tank set up for EFI. You can see we have our fuel pump module port here, fuel sending unit port right here, and our filler neck port right here. And we even have an internal fuel baffle that holds 4.8 liters to prevent fuel starvation. So this tank does require some assembly in order to make it all work. So we have three main components that we've already mentioned. We have our fuel pump itself, our fuel pump assembly, and our fuel sending unit. The fuel pump is obviously going to pressurize the system, giving us approximately 60 PSI. The fuel pump assembly is going to be what holds the fuel pump as well as the return and feed line. And the fuel sending unit is going to tell our gauge cluster how much fuel we have on board. Unfortunately, this is not exactly a plug-and-play kit. We do have to make some modifications in order to make it work. When we install this fuel pump module, you will see that there's a bit of excess material here. It can't really go all the way down. If we measure the depth of the port where the fuel pump module will be sitting, we are right at about 7 inches and 1/8. And the fuel pump module itself comes in at about a foot from its lowest point to the flange at the bottom here. In order to find out how much material we have to remove, I'm going to assemble this filter sock onto the fuel pump. You want the sock to be at least 1/8 of an inch from the bottom of the fuel tank. So let's pretend this surface is the bottom of the inside of the fuel tank. You want this sock to hover at about 1/8 of an inch above that most bottom surface. So once again, the depth of this port was 7 inches and 1/8. So because of our tank depth, we want from the bottom of this flange to the bottom of this sock to be right around 7 inches, right about there. If you had a deeper tank, this pump would sit lower, and if you had a more shallow tank, this pump would sit higher. This black tube right here is going to be the return feed for the fuel system, and the white tube is going to be what this fuel pump is connected to. So we do have to cut this white tube, and that will determine where this fuel pump itself will sit. And from the outlet port of the fuel line, I'm going to draw a straight line down, and that's going to be where we cut this white line. Once we've made this cut, I'm going to put it up against the bottom right here, simulating that it's all the way in that port. We are sitting right at about 7 inches. Since the fuel pump is going to sit right at about this location right here, there's no reason to have all this excess material. So I'm going to cut it right about, let's say, right here. Before I cut this section off, I'm going to cover the other tubes just so we don't have any metal shavings in there. All right, so right here you can see the amount of material that we removed from this side. I also hit it with a file just to get rid of any metal shavings or any rough edges. So now all that's left to do is to cut this black return line, and FiTech recommends for it to be at least 1/4 inch from the bottom of the fuel tank. So with the measurements we've already gathered, we're going to cut it at just under 7 inches. And they also recommend for it to be cut at a 45-degree angle. So that's the last of the modifications to the fuel pump assembly. Now we can actually go and install the fuel pump. Before we slip this fuel pump into its new home, they recommend heating up this plastic line before installation. You just want to heat it up enough where it gets a bit soft. You definitely don't want to melt this line, because you don't want to buy another fuel pump. And now we're going to slip on one of these clamps. The fuel pump will go in. Cool. Now we could close this clamp. And also, let's not forget to connect the fuel pump to its power source. And lastly, we're just going to secure the fuel pump to this rail right here, simply just using some zip ties. And that is it. Our fuel pump assembly is now complete. Easy, right? So with our fuel pump module now set up, I'm going to slip on the included gasket onto the assembly, and then we just install. Make sure the gasket holes align with the holes on the tank as well as the assembly. So the included hardware for this pump assembly comes with these little O-rings as well that are gonna go onto these countersunk screws, and we're just gonna give them the star pattern. The tank itself does already come with threads, so no need for tapping and dyeing it. All right, we're good, but not done, because next up, the fuel sending unit. The fuel sending unit itself is also in need of a little bit of modification, as you can see. All right, so obviously the sending unit is a bit too long, but luckily instructions are pretty clear into what we have to do. And now I finally found a use for these little mini cute Knipex pliers. We're gonna remove these 2 bolts that are holding the top bracket to the lower bracket. These are going to get completely discarded. So this top bracket is now loose from the bottom bracket. Now we're gonna remove this rheostat from this lower bracket as well. These screws we won't discard because we will be using them again. Once we slip the rheostat on, you'll see we have quite a bit of adjustability. So I'm gonna go ahead and slip on the 2 screws once again. And I'm going to keep them loose enough so I could still adjust it up and down, just like so. So there is a specific point where we have to put this, and in order to find that out, so this pivot point where the float will pivot up and down has to be at the halfway mark between the top of the tank and the bottom of the tank. So we grab our handy dandy tape measure once again, and from the top to the bottom of the tank, it measures in at 6.5 inches. So the halfway point of 6.5 inches is 3 inches and a quarter. So therefore this pivot point has to be at 3 inches and a quarter from the top to the bottom. And I put the gasket on there so we can account for that difference. So 3 1/4 would put us right. We have to take this top screw out. It does say that in the instructions, but I decided not to listen, and now I'm listening. So I wasn't able to push it all the way up because this terminal end right here was pointing downwards. So I just loosened it and bent it out of the way. So back to business. From the bottom of this flange to this pivot point, we need to be at 3 1/4. So if I mark a straight line across, should be somewhere right about there. So I'm gonna hold it and tighten it down. 3 1/4, cool beans. So this is the proper adjustment for this rheostat. Now we have to install this float, which is another bit of adjustments. And it already comes pre-installed with this little rod in here. So we gotta remove this. And don't spin it, don't throw it out of its orientation. We're just gonna pop it in right here. And if you notice, we obviously have too much length here, but that's where this adjustment comes in. So the way that we know we have the correct length on this rod is when it's tapped all the way up and it can't go any further, we're about 1/8 of an inch from the top of this gasket surface. So that looks about right to me. So we're gonna make our mark where we have to cut the excess. And they also recommend for this rheostat to be the lowest point of this whole assembly. So therefore we have to cut off all this extra too. So now that we have all of our adjustments made, I'm going to disassemble so we could make our cuts. I'm going to slip this, this temporary rod back in just so we don't spin it out of rotation. I am going to disconnect the rheostat completely just so we don't accidentally cut it. Right here you can see the amount that was trimmed off of either pieces. This is the final result. Let's put it back together. So once again, after all that modification, we are left with this final assembly. It kind of looks all small and cute now. But yeah, this is it. And this will get installed in the same fashion as the fuel pump module. Make sure we're not pinching any of the wires. All right, hardware is included, so that's nice. And it also comes with a couple O-ring gaskets on each one of these as well. It's coming along, guys, it's coming along. It's such a hot and humid day here in Arizona. It's kind of hard to function. All right, guys, the tank's looking good. We're about 80% done. We just got to bolt on one last thing. This one is at least easy peasy. It's just the filler neck and a little cork gasket. And that is it, ladies and gents. The tank is fully dressed. There was a little bit of tinkering involved to get these parts to work, but I mean, that's no surprise. These pumps are usually universal, so they're kind of meant to work with everything. But our EFI fuel tank is now ready for install. This bad boy's just gonna pop right in like a factory tank. Oh man, it looks good in here. It's so crazy to see this because all of my life I've been driving these cars and I've been in the trunk and it just looks so weird having these two new ports there. So the next step for the Scrappy Boy is routing this braided fuel line. So what I'm thinking is, since we already have 2 ports facing the passenger side, we might as well route it this way. I'm thinking maybe having them come out over here, have it follow along the frame rails, then it would pop out right here somewhere on the passenger side. And that's another thing, do I route it on the passenger side or the driver's side? From the factory, it did run through the driver's side. I'm thinking it might be better to do it on the passenger side since there's, I mean, not a whole lot going on over here compared to this side that will have our master cylinder with brake lines coming in, our steering shaft with couplers around here, as well as the header is going to be sitting here, throttle linkage as well. The only negative I see about the passenger side is that we're going to be running close to this alternator cable, and I don't know about running fuel right next to 12 volts. But I think it's our best solution. I guess it's all hypothetical until we put the engine in there and see what will work and what will not. And that also means the car's going back up on jack stands. So looking at the inside of the trunk, since the fuel lines are going to exit this way, we might as well use this hole that was for the fuel sending unit. From the factory, it was routed towards the bottom of the car, but we are no longer going to be using this. That was easy. Pop that sucker out. We're gonna go ahead and enlarge this hole to 7/8. Yeah, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. We gotta add another one right next to it. I'm gonna mark my hole. Nice. Cool beans, so both the pressurized line and the return line now have pass-throughs. This is what it looks like on the other side of those grommets. We have to remove that exhaust hanger that's just dangling there, but yeah, so far so good. Also, I want to mention that this area that's around here, what supports the tank, is a bit too far gone. You can see some of the rust holes along the bottom right here. So we are going to have to fix that once we start driving it. I feel like if I were to hit a speed bump or something, gravity itself will yank the tank through the trunk. But for the first start and what we're doing right now, we should be okay. So they did include 40 feet of fuel line, but we're probably not going to use all of it. So I want to try and get a rough estimate of how much it'll be. We'll call it a foot right there, 10 feet, and then up and over to the engine, 1 foot. And then from this side to the FiTech unit, we're about 2 feet. I would say we're probably gonna run 14 feet for the pressure line and 14 feet back for the return. So we got a whole lot of fuel line to play with. Actually, I'm gonna start from the front and then work my way back, because this way we can just run it through the bottom as is and then feed it through that grommet in the end, rather than having to feed the entire line through the small hole and then back up here. So I'm just gonna unravel some of this line and send it on south. I'm also gonna pull it all the way back just so we know how much slack we need. I would say that's good. Actually, I might as well route it over the cross member while we're here. Alrighty folks, I went ahead and routed most of the pressure line, so I kind of have it mocked up roughly where it needs to go. As you can see, it'll come out the other side of this grommet and then lead towards the front of the car. I have it a little bit loose right here because I think this is where I want to add that fuel filter. From there, it does a slight bend in the transmission tunnel. It goes through the transmission tunnel all the way down here towards the cross member. From the cross member, it then goes up into the engine bay. And that's where we're at so far. I need to secure it in here somewhere. I'm thinking along like this, then it could go shoot straight into the FiTech unit. But in order to know how to hook this thing up, we've got to put the actual unit on. So this fuel line has to go towards the driver's side of the FiTech unit. That is the pressure side, and the passenger side is the return side. Alrighty folks, the routing is finally done. As you can see, this line is just gonna come directly into this port. It's gonna go right into here with a straight AN fitting. But now we have to find out where we want to place these fuel filters. So I think for the 10 micron filter, we have our transmission tunnel right here and our axle right here. I think I want to place this filter right about here. It seems like the perfect location for the amount of space that we have. And for this smaller filter, I think I want to place it right around where the transmission cross member is, probably right about here. And then that'll be a good place to tie this line so it's not loose in this area. So the entire fuel line is going to have to come out in order for us to make all of our cuts and our fittings. But before we do that, I'm going to mock up where the AN fitting has to go so I know where the stainless line has to be cut. And I'm simply just going to mark it with tape and label it as throttle body. I'm gonna do the same thing to identify where I want this smaller filter. So one of the ends goes right here, the other end goes right here. I'm going to make a pointer arrow to where we want to make our cut. Same procedure for the larger filter. I put a 45-degree AN fitting on here just because it's going to head that way. That's the end of this fitting. Now for this one, I'm going to add a little bit more slack just in case. And for the fuel pump area, I'm also going to use 45-degree fittings because well, the routing technically just goes 45 degrees that way. So it should look something like this. But I'm not going to cut this side just yet. I'm gonna save this one for last. All right, time to undo everything we just did so we could add all our fittings. They did include a masking tape in order for us to cut it without fraying. Let's see what happens. With that end cut, I probably could have wound the tape a little bit tighter, but so far it doesn't look like it frayed too bad. I'm gonna try to lift off this tape without pulling on the little strands. Okay, so far so good. Come on, please. It wants to pop out. All right, first one success. You can see that inside the rubber portion of the tube is sitting flush up against this fitting. All right, now for the other portion of this fitting, we have to put this in there without this tube sliding out. It's going to add a little bit of grease onto this fitting. And I'm going to place a small bit of tape right here because if this starts pushing the hose outwards, we'll be able to see. All right. And we can see that the tape did not move downwards, so that's a good fitting right there. Awesome. And also for the ends that I've already cut, I'm going to bag them just so we don't have any schmoo going in there. All right, we got all of our lines and fittings done finally, and we ended up with 3 different sections. We have this one that is going to be connected straight to our fuel pump on our fuel tank. This end gets connected to our fuel filter. Then the center section gets connected to this other fuel filter. and then this other section goes straight to the throttle body. So these two are ready for install. This one still needs a final trimming, but we'll leave that one for last. All right, let's get these things connected. So from the throttle body, it's following the same path as before. Now it's time for the second hose. So here's that fuel line that was coming from the engine bay. As you can see, we already put on the smaller filter. So now we link up the second section of our fuel system. And I've seen a lot that people recommend using aluminum wrenches rather than whatever option you have, mostly steel. And that's for you not to scratch them up. But I've been pretty rough on these. I've been beating them up, and I'm using regular wrenches and I haven't seen any scratches on them, so that's one thing to note. And we're just gonna continue with the same clamps we had before. It also probably would have been easier to use a big clamp for both hoses rather than using an individual clamp per hose. So I might make that change later on. All right, now we're back at the rear axle location, and we're gonna make sure we have the right direction of flow on this filter. So this fuel filter, once again, is gonna be sitting right here. Now the third and last portion of the fuel line comes into play, and we put a 45-degree AN fitting on this portion just so it could aim or point towards the frame rail. And from the grommet, we are now back in the tank where we have one last fitting to do right to the fuel pump, and we're gonna use a 45-degree once again for the fuel pump on the pressure side and on the return side. All right, that is the last of the pressure line. We have two 45-degree fittings on here. Let's throw it on. Alrighty, now that completes the plumbing for the pressure line. The return line is going to follow the same route all the way to the back. Luckily with that one, there's only two fittings that we're gonna have to attach. The one that hooks up to this port and the one that hooks up to this return side. We still have to add some clamps in a couple more locations to make sure that our fuel filters and fuel line are secure. Also, I wanted to apologize for something you guys probably didn't even notice. For months now, we have been uploading every 4 to 5 days, and this video is going on its 8th day. Kind of beating myself up over it, but sometimes these things take way longer than planned. Not to mention that it is now 1,000 degrees here in Arizona, and I feel like I've been working with half a brain. But once again, I wanted to apologize. I feel like I'm letting you guys down, mostly letting myself down. But we will continue on the Scrappy Boy in the next video. And for the people wondering when we're gonna get back to work on the glass par, pretty much every next step that we can take with this car renders it immobilized. And in order to start the Scrappy Boy, we have to let it idle for a while, so that means it has to be outside. So we have to be able to drive this thing out in order to get the Scrappy Boy out for its first start. We're so close to getting this thing started, guys. I know I say that every video, but once we get it started, we can get back to work on the glass par as well as focus on getting the Scrapstang drivable. So yeah, with that being said, thank you guys for hanging out. We'll see you on the next one.